Okay. All right, we're back. Welcome to another edition of the Perception Action Journal Club. Again, talking about Turvey's lectures on perception. Moving to chapters 5 and 6 today. Happy to have Andrew back, and this time Marianne is joining us. We needed another brain on this one because it's pretty heavy going. I don't know if I told you, Andrew, I've got a few pieces of feedback from people that they are enjoying seeing us struggle a little bit. It's making them feel better about themselves.
Good.
I've got at least 3 or 4 people say that. I'm like, okay, well, today will be another great example of that as we fight to understand and pull key points out, because these are some tricky ones.
Turns out this stuff is hard.
Yes. Yeah.
Been struggling for 5 years.
Yeah. So Marianne, is this your first pass through this book, or have you read it before?
It's my first pass through this book. I have read some of Turvey's papers, or many of Turvey's papers, and sections of this, and obviously Colga, Kelsall. I got really into coordinate structures, dissipative structures, and stuff like that. I think, like I said before, because I was always trying to see things through a multi-species lens and be able to explore how perception, action, and learning would work for humans and human-horse relationships, human-dog relationships, multi-species relationships. When I first read them, although I completely blew my mind, it was like somebody gave me this sneak preview at like a peak of something really, really, really amazing, and then I just couldn't grasp it again. You're like waking up from a dream, thinking, oh no, I can't remember it. So that was, I was hooked. I just felt that I needed to work hard to try and clock in, but for the first time, and I think we'll get into this here, for the first time there was some acknowledgement of humans being part of the animal kingdom, and other animals also perceiving and acting.
We'll touch on that a little bit today, won't we?
We'll get into that. Yeah. So all the bits that were a complete hook for me were in there. So
yeah. The other kind of comment I thought, well, Andrew and I talked about this a little bit, but I think it's clear. I want to make it clear to people, this book is not so much about providing evidence for one approach or another. It's framing the question. So the last episode we did was about indirect versus direct perception. So it wasn't really providing evidence so much for direct perception. It was saying, what does it mean for perception to be direct? Right. Which is different, I think. So this is not really an evidence book. He's not going to cite lots of studies on, experimental studies that prove one way or another. It's more how do you ask the questions in the right way?
I think if you wanted a textbook that was more along that sort of traditional textbook structure, then the Blau and Wagman textbook that came out a couple of years ago is the place to begin. That's that kind of book.
Yeah. They'll talk about, for sure. This is very different. He's got a different job here. So, all right. So let's get it. So the first chapter we're going to look at is chapter 5, the mechanistic. What's the exact title of this?
Hypothesis,
Getting into
these 2 chapters go together quite nicely, actually.
Yes,
they form a nice kind of pair.
So.
We meet the villain in these chapters.
Yeah, the true villain. So the chapter 5 is the mechanistic hypothesis, in chapter 6, the Cartesian program.
Yes.
So the chapter 5 is really carrying on from what we talked about last time, getting into kind of the quantum mechanics a little bit and what it means to be And then chapter 6 is really getting more into how this applied to psychology, the main Cartesian approach.
Yes.
So, Angela, I think you make I've heard you talk about this before. The difference between the mechanistic approach and a mechanism.
Yeah.
For a mechanism for, like, this is a criticism I hear a lot of. What's the mechanism for perception action coupling?
Yes.
Can talk about what's the neural mechanism, what's the, so but that's not quite what he's exactly talking about here.
No. So this lecture is going to lay out the mechanist hypothesis and point out some problems with it, the mechanistic hypothesis. And so, but there is a resurgence of the notion of mechanism in philosophy of science. It's kind of referred to as the neo-mechanism literature, and it's people like William Bechtel and Karl Craver and lots of people like that. And the difference is, so the mechanistic hypothesis is effectively the very Cartesian 17th century physics idea that pretty much everything is a machine of some kind, and machine in that kind of automaton, kind of clunky kind of sense, anything that you might sort of, like in that kind of sense. Whereas the neo-mechanistic literature and philosophy of science is about developing explanations of how things work. And the goal there is to lay out all the pieces and identify how all those pieces relate to one another, but they can be more interesting than the kind of mechanistic, robotic kind of sense here. And so whether or not they're compatible, people disagree. So I've written a couple of papers where I've sort of identified that ecological psychology probably is doing neo-mechanistic explanation. And the key there is that we talk about real parts and processes. That's the real distinction with a mechanistic explanation rather than just a description of what's going on. Your description of the mechanism is actually an attempt, you actually model the real parts. So for us, the real parts are things like affordances and effectivities and the information that couples them. And so I'm reasonably convinced you can tell an ecological mechanistic story. We come up with, I think we're in a good position in psychology to come up with mechanistic explanations of behavior, but we're not doing Cartesian mechanism. Those are just those are different. And so
or kind of doing the traditional cognitive psychology, putting perception in a box, with the box with decision making. We're actually trying to get more explanatory power.
That's what I think anyway. And I wrote it all. I did a paper a couple of years ago in EcoPsych about this. And so some people disagree, but I kind of think a lot of the objections are wrong-headed, I think. And so we're gonna be mad at mechanistic kind of descriptions of things, robotic, mechanical kinds of explanations of behavior, and that's okay.
For sure. Marianne, do you have any initial thoughts about this one? It's a hard one to give a simple takeaway message, but what did you get from reading this?
From that, I guess we'll get into this, is just that it's really useful to have some insight into the sort of view of the world that shaped those mechanistic science, and we talked a little bit before we came on the idea that this. I mean, I always think they made some major flaws right at the beginning in terms of what they were going to look at. So they separated humans from other animals, ignored evolution. Lots of things focused on vision. So vision is as a perception. And if you looked at, for example, dogs and scent, you'd end up with a completely different story, because they pick up information over multiple timescales and of different things. So I think where they started shaped an awful lot of how we've ended up. And I think it's really useful to go back and visit that. It's this idea that these traditional ideas are so imbued in our everyday language and the way we're brought up that we just don't think about them, and we don't see them as problematic.
Yes.
I think that's a good one. So what is what are the key in this mechanistic hypothesis? What are the key elements of this is it linear series of causes?
That's part of it.
Yeah.
So we still have this very limited notion of cause. So Descartes appealing to these linear chains of local causation. So one of the rules is no action at a distance, right? No spooky action at a distance. And so if something happens, then the thing that caused it must have come into some kind of contact with it. And usually they literally kind of mean mechanical contact, hence mechanistic. And that's part of it. And so that's one of the things, is that you're dealing with, and Turvey's already introduced the idea that that notion of causation is probably too boring to allow cognition to occur. And that we're probably going to have to get more interesting about what kinds of causes we're going to count. So that's the first part of it. And then the second distinction that comes out is the distinction between primary and secondary properties.
Yeah.
And considering that, so primary things are like the mass of a rock, right? It's a thing that's it's a thing that the rock has that is part of it being rock, right? Whereas the color of the rock is this secondary property. It's not something. It's something that the rock has, but it has it in virtue of.
Yeah, it's dependent on the. Yeah.
Yeah, and the idea is that the primary qualities are the real physical ones, and the secondary ones are a bit dodgy.
Yes.
And so we're going to have. So we're not allowed to rely too heavily on those.
Okay.
Is this the chapter where they make the distinction between sort of the mind and body? So the fact that most things have are basically, like our bodies are just lumps of dead meat. There's no local intelligence in any of those parts, and that the brain is the knowing about the brain is the bit that has to stitch all those bits together as such. Which again creates lots of problems, doesn't it?
Yeah. So that really gets fleshed out in the next lecture, but it's definitely lurking in here.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Next one.
Yeah. So I mean, right. So again, like Rob was saying, we have to remember what the lectures are trying to achieve. At this point, we're not developing a theory of perception. We're trying to figure out what the rules are.
Yeah.
What are the allowable pieces that we're allowed to build our theory of perception out of? And if you're going to have a theory of perception, you have to have a theory. You have to have an understanding of what there is to be perceived, first of all. And so that's why everyone's excited about physics, and that's why we're talking a lot about what counts as a real physical property, and what counts as a thing that you are allowed real access to. Yeah. And it's Descartes, right? Lots of people were doing various elements of this, but Descartes' the guy that brings it all together.
Yeah, and then he talks about, gets into things like different appearance versus reality, right? Like the example he uses, the sun, right? The sun appears to, everyone says the sun rises in the west, right? The sun doesn't actually rise, right? That's we move relative to the sun. So he brings in a couple of examples, and I think and very true to Gibson. Turvey likes to bring in examples from other kind of very different context to illustrate things. I think that's something Gibson likes to do, bring an animal. So he talks about the Monsteria gigantea, like lots of different. Yeah, this one.
So it's sorry, go, Marianne.
No, go ahead, Andrew. As you can tell, this is a hard one. I find this chapter very hard to pick a plan to talk about. It's very.
He's setting up here this idea that what we perceive cannot be trusted.
That's definitely part of it. So they introduce, right? So there's now in the analysis of where things are at, of what the physical world is, and then what the basis of, say, vision is, because people think that the basis of vision is the retinal image, and because they're developing this kind of three-part indirect perception thing, there's this notion that there can be some slippage now. There's room for what you experience to not be what the world actually is. And so the example of that, as Rob was saying, is we stand on the surface of the earth and it looks like the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. But what's actually going on is that the earth is turning. And those two things produce exactly the same optical consequence, and we can't tell them apart. But there's also a lot of other information around us to say that the world isn't spinning frantically, so it looks like the sun is moving, right? Mm-hmm. And so the big trick here is that there's room for perception and reality to not be exactly the same. And there's some examples where it's your experience doesn't map onto the way we know things actually are. Mm-hmm. And it took reason to get to the way things actually are, right? Empiricism, experience didn't get you there, right? And so there's all these threads in science coming together, with Copernicus doing his model of the solar system and flipping everything around, and other people, Newton doing his things and Descartes doing his things, and various people are contributing all these elements, and the elements add up to perception. Is not necessarily a faithful reflection of what's going on out in the world, and it seems to need the assistance of reason or intellect of some kind in order to be able to get off the ground and working, because the raw material is impoverished. If you look at the retinal image, it's not enough. And also there are some just really straightforward examples where experience doesn't match what's actually going on. And to be honest, so just to set this up, Turvey's going to claim that this kind of analysis underpins all of modern psychology effectively. Well, what's modern psychology really excited about? Visual illusions, right? Yeah. What's an illusion? Where your experience doesn't match what's actually going on, and these are supposed to tell us something interesting about vision. So again, right, we're setting up the theoretical underpinnings for what's currently going on in psychology.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Senator. That makes me think of the difference between direct perception and realism.
Mm-hmm.
And when people hear direct perception, not to say you're accurately vertically perceiving the real world, because that's not the job of a perceptual system, right? The way Turvey defined it is to not. All perception is subjective and objective at the same time, to use Gibson's terms, right? But that, I think the sun and the examples, right? It's you have to take into account the observer and the environment. I think that's kind of what I take away from it.
From the point of view of someone like Descartes, that counts as cheating.
Yes.
That's quite important, right? So we're going to have to acknowledge that within the Cartesian program, you're not allowed to do that kind of move, because you're introducing effectively impredicative relations and all those kinds of things. And those count as illegitimate moves. And so that's why things like affordances are weird.
Yeah, I was going to say affordances are inherently inaccurate. Like if I perceive stairs steeper, the same set of stairs steeper than you, that's not reflecting reality, right?
Right.
So yeah, I think that's. I'm sorry, that was a tangent, but I thought that was an important point.
I think both of you have talked about this a lot, and Andrew, you just did there around the focus then of modern psychology being about the things that we don't do so well, or the times that our perceptual systems are tricked, as it were. Not about actually when it does work and what we are amazing at doing. And if you think about, from an evolutionary perspective, we don't need to know that it's the sun that's moving for day-to-day life as we've evolved as a species. So when you flip it the other way around and think about what information actually matters and is meaningful for us to move, which is what the first 4 chapters set us up to do, I think that gets us to a different place. I also find it, I have to smile to think that, like this impredictivity, the loopiness of causality and complex adaptive systems were seen as so wrong, but it was perfectly okay to insert God in there instead.
No, exactly.
Souls, like God does this and then it's in the soul. And you just think how times have changed in terms of what we think is okay or not okay to be able to plug into that space.
Yeah. Descartes literally whacked some God in there in order to solve a couple of his problems. And everybody was like, well,
straight up, that's fine.
You are absolutely right there. That's a nice contrast, actually, because it is, like Yes, I like that idea. That like what counts as crazy and what counts as okay depends a little bit on when you are talking. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Let's maybe. I guess we can go back. You're right. These two chapters really fit together.
I think before we move on to the next chapter, because I think that's really
it's getting
really
more
nice example of that.
It's a great example because it's got a lot of really useful things.
Yeah.
You know, there's some really useful things lurking in here. Turvey's a little obscure about. He doesn't really bring them out. Yeah. So let's bring some of them out.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think chapter 6 to me has a little more relevance to kind of what we're talking about here. Okay. We're talking about Cartesian.
Okay.
Yeah. So did you want to talk about the...
Oh, yeah. Sorry. I was going to say, it'd be nice to... I'll start and help me. So one of the things that he brings up is the idea of a vine seedling, and it'll, as it grows, it moves towards shadow. So it's, what it's connected to perceptually would be, light, the amount of light, and it moves towards shadow because a shadow is more likely to be a tree, and a tree or is something that can then grow around. And so if you put something in its environment that casts a shadow, it's likely to go there, not because it thinks it's a tree, but because it's perceptually coupled to a particular information that's meaningful from its evolution. And again, I think this is where it's really important that our perceptual systems are based on the world that has been in our evolutionary past, not necessarily in the immediate future, which is why, when you put something that's not a tree in a vine, that vine's environment, then, as an individual, it's going to make a mistake. But from the evolutionary perspective, it's a sensible perceptual coupling.
And lurking in that analysis is actually the question of, does the vine make a mistake by moving towards the tube that the experimenter sticks into the setting? And Turvey argues, actually, no, it makes no mistake. And there's a related example in the Turvey et al. 1981 Ecological Laws paper about misperception, and about there's an example of an experiment where you have a shark that can detect electrical fields, and it will go digging where the electrical field is, because that's how it finds fish that are hidden in the sand. And you can stick a fake electrical field generator underneath the sand, and the shark will go digging there. And the question is, does the shark make a mistake? In the same way as, does the vine make a mistake? Did it misperceive the presence of a fish? Did it misperceive the presence of a tree? No, right? It didn't. It was coupled to the information, and within the scope of its life, there's a specification relationship there, right? Now, there's a one-to-one lawful mapping where the biggest shadow is cast by the closest tree within the bounds of the niche that this organism has evolved in, right? And so it would have been, Turvey argues in the 81 paper, he says, it would have been a mistake for the shark not to dig.
Yeah.
And so just because an evil experimenter has come in and futzed with things doesn't actually mean you haven't revealed a mistake. And so that's quite, and so that gets, there's a sentence here on page 69 of the book. He's talking about how that coupling lets the vine, it motivates pragmatically true (brackets useful) action. And so what counts as true is not about being some faithful copy of the world. What counts as true is it functional within the niche of the organism? And that, again, like that's actually a really huge step that he's making. Like Descartes would be like, what are you talking about? Right? That's not what truth means, right?
Yeah.
But it's going to be part of the maneuvers that we're going to have to make at some point. So again, yeah.
Yeah, no, I like both of those examples, right? You've violated specification.
Yes.
Artificially, right? And the animal's behaving as if it was specifying information based on its previous experience, right? Which is what it's supposed to do. So it didn't make it right.
Towards the end of this, I haven't got it up in front of me. I have to flick through. Is where I think he sets up again this idea that something doesn't exist until you can either measure it or name it, which again is complete. You're going to flip that concept.
Yes. Well, this gets us back. That gets back into the impredicativity things, and he's just So right. So yeah, you're right, Rob, that it's hard to find the key thread because he's actually bouncing around between a couple of things. So on the one hand, he's laying out the rules, and on the other hand, he is poking holes in the rules. But he's not the thrust of the chapter doesn't feel like it's a critique of these things. He's supposed to just be laying it out in exposition right now, but he is actually poking some holes in it. And so, yeah, and it's basically about what counts as a real property, right? And so therefore, what can perception possibly be about? And therefore, what is it that, say, the visual system needs to be able to recover from the retinal image in order to be able to be said to be perceiving, right?
Yeah.
And so these are all the ground rules that we have to work with. But there's a couple of kind of independent things banging on here.
Yeah. It gets into this 3 grades of sense.
So that's
some key, like a lot of things like connects with Gibson here for me, like Gibson's famous quote, how can we have a indirect representation needed to perceive the world that assumes that where did it come from in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
Cart kind of waves his hands. God gave it to us. Yeah. Now we just born with it. So that's so there's a lot of kind of key messages. The idea of alone on intelligence, which we always hammer on about in ecological psychology, right?
You go, Marianne.
Are you sure? I don't know. I was just going to say this. There's almost like an ethical bit in this as well. But I find it difficult to read, sort of Cartesian mechanistic science without thinking that there's almost just the complete refusal to acknowledge animals or anything other than machines, like autonomous.
Mm-hmm.
Autonomous is. I think there's an ethical element to that as well. It allows you to do things to them, and so I always, maybe I shouldn't, but when I read some of this, I think that there's some intentionality in what people want to be able to do in the world that ends up in these theories.
Yeah. Yes. Well, another way to think about that might be that some of those ethical problems emerge from the fact that it's this Cartesian analysis that separates people and animals that's sitting at the bottom of a lot of this understanding of psychology. And so Descartes separates those things out for various reasons. And then one of the consequences of that is that, well, animals and humans are clearly qualitatively different things, and therefore can be treated qualitatively differently. Yeah.
And then separating the mind and the body is the other bit, which then gets into these 3.
Yeah, the 3 grades of sense. Yeah. Yeah, the classic mind-bodily dualism. Yeah.
Yes.
So the first one's the body, isn't it?
So right. Okay. So we're in lecture 6, the Cartesian program.
Yeah, we jumped to
And
first grade of sense, reflexive behavior brought about by
it's the thing that animals and humans have in common, namely that your body does stuff and is set up to do some things by itself, just
reflexively.
Environment. Yeah.
Second is the fact that mechanical activity is basic awareness. Is the second grade of sense. Okay. And then we have consciousness, I guess.
Almost, yeah. So the second grade is it's the subjective awareness, the idea, the sensation that not just of light but of brightness, for example.
Yeah.
And so you're starting. So the second grade of sense gets you to secondary qualities like color, and the things that people talk about us making up or inventing or imposing on the world, right? And then the third grade of sense is effectively it's intellect, right? It's that intellectual contribution that's required to go beyond experience, to go beyond sort of empiricism, and to be able to
identify things. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, and to see through to the truth of things, right? And it's funny because Descartes is talking about that third grade of sense as being made of symbols.
Yeah.
It's a symbol system. It has to be a symbol system. And he was thinking of it sort of in part as a language system, but obviously the symbols were also mathematical symbols, because you can do, that was the other big thread that's going on here, was that people were inventing maths and discovering all the incredible things you can do with maths. And symbol systems have all this flexibility, right? So the number 4 could be about fingers, could be about horses, could be about anything, right? And that's quite cool. And so so the third grade of sense, that intellect, that thing that really makes humans special, is symbol manipulation that we can use to do all this abstract kind of reasoning. And animals don't have that, right? We're the special ones. And let's have a look at let's check in with modern cognitive psychology and see how look, it's a symbol system, right? The whole thing's a symbol system. We call it computation now, because that's the kind of symbol system that somebody invented that has a lot of useful properties that somebody decided would be quite handy for a cognitive system. So it's, I think Turvey makes quite a compelling argument that modern cognitive psychology sits right on top of Descartes.
I love the bit. I'm not sure where it is, where he gets, he almost like, he does like, there's this like incredulity that despite all of this and these 3 different phases, and the fact that it's symbols and it's previous knowledge or learning of intelligence, that we kind of all end up with something very similar. Almost as if to say that's amazing that we we perceive something almost identical, and yet we've embellished it through something internal. How did we all manage to do the same embellishment?
Yeah.
I have to find it, but
that's a good point.
It's one of his little like pokes, isn't it?
I think that's a common ecological psychology, even ecological dynamics refrain. It's not that this wouldn't work or you could do it this way. It's just unnecessarily complicated. Why do we need all this when we could do it much more? So it's not denying, it's not saying it's wrong, like it's not going to work, right? That's what.
But without this learn on intelligence, we'd all end up with like such disparate experiences of the world that they wouldn't overlap in the way that they do.
Yeah, I ran into that actually when I wrote the paper about interface theory, and I really dug into interface theory. So it's really, interface theory is it's an attempt to be really, really formal about the commitments of of studying perception, etc. And coming to the idea is supposedly that it uses these evolutionary models to show that you end up with these perceptual systems that don't necessarily have any direct mapping to what's going on in the actual real world, that we sort of invent these interfaces. And the idea is that they're compulsory, that we have to have them. But it was really funny when I was reading that paper and writing mine defending Gibson from it, was interface theory takes the basic premises of cognitive psychology, runs with them, runs through all of the implications with them, and Hoffman just goes, well, this is clearly how it is, as opposed to what you just said, Marianne. And one of those implications is the solipsism, the idea that we're actually just living in our own heads, and the fact that we have anything in common is a minor miracle. Hoffman's claim is basically, well, this is just how it is, whereas all the rest of us are going, no, that's a problem.
Yeah.
And it was really clear in interface theory. It was unavoidably the case that you end up with this weird kind of inventing your own reality kind of setup.
I found it. It's page 80, bottom of page 80. It says the operations of the 3rd grade of sense underwrite a truly remarkable human achievement. Every person knows about the world and behaves felicitously, despite being directly aware of nothing more than the activity in his or her own brain. I think that sums up quite nicely. That if you haven't got that learn on intelligence, you would just think, well, we'd have such disparate.
You have to appeal to some
experiences.
Yeah.
And so, and the other really important thing about those loans of intelligence is that they are actually unrepayable. loans of intelligence. Turvey points out in here that Descartes makes those loans and has no intention of paying them back. And everybody was okay with that, including the manager of the intellect bank, right?
Can you unpack what that means and what we mean by that? That's so we can't pay them back.
So
the loans.
A loan of intelligence, I think it's a Dan Dennett phrase, and it basically means that you've developed this theory that's got a hole in it, and the only way to plug that hole is to bring in somebody else who tells you the trick, and that lets you carry on going on. And basically,
experience or memory or whatever it is.
Right, absolutely. So you can't bootstrap. You set yourself up into a situation where you can't bootstrap your way all the way up to the solution, and someone else has to come and help you. And so, in a conversation, you're allowed to borrow intelligence from other people. That's what language is for. But when you're building a perceptual system, if you build your perceptual system and it requires a loan of intelligence in order to work, then the question is, where did that intelligence come from?
Yeah.
Because basically, where did you get that additional piece of information from in order to solve your problem? And so Dennett came up with this phrase because he identified, and then Turvey makes a big case out of the fact that a lot of the theories that try to build a theory of perception and action and cognition out of 17th century physics end up with a hole in them that they have to fill by borrowing intelligence from somewhere, and then the different theories borrow the intelligence from different places. And so these loans of intelligence are okay if and only if you can tell a story about where that intelligence came from. How do you pay the loan back, right? So so we encounter later on George Berkeley, who his notion is that vision borrows intelligence from touch in order to get to 3D space, because touch has this privileged, in his account, touch has this privileged access to 3D space, and it's the thing that provides, but it's still baked into the organism, so it's not cheating. It's a loan of intelligence that you can tell a story about how it gets paid up. At least that's the argument, right? Descartes makes loans of intelligence in order to get his thing to work, but he literally goes, well, the intelligence bit comes from God, who provides us with some innate knowledge, as Marianne was explaining, provides us with some innate knowledge to fill the gaps. That's the thing that enables us and as soon as you have any loan where you're borrowing from God, we tend to think of that as a loan that can never possibly be repaid, right? Your theory requires a move that is cheating, effectively.
Yeah.
And so
like that, the one I like, if I take like recognition prime decision making, Gary Klein's model, I perceive the world using these kind of stored templates I have from my previous experience. That's the loan. What you can't pay back is, how did I ever start perceiving the world in the first place? Right? Where did those? Because I started to have no previous experiences to build on. How do I perceive in the first place?
Yes,
and so it's kind of circular. There's lots more different ways we do that, but yeah, that's the idea.
So the modern name for the particular loan of intelligence that representational stories make is called the symbol grounding problem, right? That's what the symbol grounding problem is. Symbols are wonderful in that they are abstract and are distinct from the things that they represent, but in order to be meaningful, you have to tell a story about how those symbols are connected to the things that they represent.
Learn the symbols, yeah.
And so if you're developing a numerical system, the intelligence is coming from the human being building the numerical system. But for a cognitive system, where's the external source of information to ground the symbols? And so symbol grounding is the loan of intelligence that everybody used to try and pay back. Everybody sort of forgot that it was a loan that had been incurred around about 2000 and sort of stopped trying to pay it back. Hoffman, to his credit for the interface theory, recognizes he needs a grounding mechanism, and he tries to ground everything in action, which is very trendy. Yeah. But whether or not you can do it is another question, right?
Yes. No, sorry, I just wanted to clear it.
Someone's asking, because it's important.
Yeah, that'll come up again, and that's. Okay.
And like we said at the beginning, it's really interesting that in the time, in Descartes' time, that it was perfectly legitimate to to have the loan of intelligence from God, but not
Yes.
and other things weren't legitimate that we would consider more so nowadays. And I think because evolution wasn't in there either. So if I think about, particularly go back to the previous chapter and that idea of, like what do we conceptually attuned to? It's more than just what's based in our, in the current lived experience of an animal, human or otherwise. But that doesn't have to be a loan from God.
Yes, but it's funny that you say that, actually, because yes, people do try to pay back, and basically instead of saying God did it, they say evolution did it, which is at least potentially more useful, but not necessarily.
You still have to be able to explain it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
The seedling, for example, is attuned to specific information through that species, what it's become attuned to through evolution.
Yeah.
Not because of that individual seedling's experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we have some a different, which again goes back to that's why is a shark, attuned to electrical stimuli and we're not. Why do we no longer have a great sense of smell like a dog and be able to tell those stories?
Mm-hmm.
We have a different perceptual apparatus.
Yeah. Huh.
Yeah. So, okay. I'm trying to look at my notes here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other key points in the Cartesian? Kind of. So obviously, we're going back to the 2-item versus the 3-item. That's going back a couple approach to, perceiving.
Yes.
Cartesian obviously is a 3-item, inserting mental processes, the mind in the middle, versus direct perception.
Yes. So I guess one way to think about these two chapters, so the mechanistic hypothesis is a hypothesis about what kinds of physical properties are allowed and how do they interact with one another so that one thing causes another thing. And that sets out the things you're allowed to build your theory out of. And then the Cartesian program is how Descartes brought all those pieces that he was allowed to bring together into an accounting of how something like cognition effectively could be. And so he took all those pieces and assembled a very comprehensive and very rigorous theory that brought everything together to try and account for all the bits. And the place he ended up was dualism. That there was animals and humans, and that there was mind and body, and that these things needed to relate to each other in various ways, but also were different, and that they did different things. And God had to be involved by providing innate knowledge. So perhaps evolution provides some of that knowledge in the form of, that's what genes do, right? They make you a certain way, and they embody that generational kind of learning. And then all of that is still with us. That Cartesian program built out of the mechanistic hypothesis is still the intellectual underpinning for modern cognitive psychology.
Yes. Yeah.
That's the big picture here.
Isn't at some point he explicitly says that for Descartes that perceiving is thinking.
Probably. Yes.
Yeah. So it's that sort of, cognition is the thing. That's the thing that's then primacy in this.
Yes.
Yeah. This is effort. Just resonates with me a little bit in the ecological dynamic when we talk about coaching, right? I always get coached. I don't need a theory coaches. That I'm like, okay, you pull out this underlying theory that people have long ago forgot on which your practice is built. I think that's what Turvey's trying to do here a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
This is the underlying historical where it came from. Still holds on to a lot of these assumptions that you forgot about a long time ago, and you probably wouldn't have a modern cognitive psychologist want to use this description. It sounds offensive in a way to their program, but I think he's trying to draw this connection. Yeah.
And so he gets to the end on page 84. He says the Cartesian program defined. And he says, we have taken a lengthy and cluttered path to get here, which is very true.
No kidding.
But we are now ready to define the program. And there's three things he says. So develop as thoroughly as you can a mechanical account of how that first grade, how the perceptual systems, how the sensory things pick up light and all that sort of stuff. Then identify the kind of knowledge that you need in order to make things up based on what the first grade has given you. And the final thing is figure out the symbol manipulating procedures required to implement the whole process. And so Turvey obviously knows that that's also literally what cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience is up to, but he's basically saying that that's what Descartes told them to do.
Yeah.
And I think they might just have to suck that up. Like I feel like it's pretty obviously true.
Yeah. Is it? It's almost. One is sensation, two is perception, and three is cognition.
Kind of.
Still teach it that way. That's still exactly the way we teach it, right?
Yeah.
Of course, called sensation and perception, and we hint at there's these top-down influences too that that are going to come in three.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
And this idea then that you can't perceive something unless you can name it, for example. And I straight away go, how do babies, like pre-language children and animals perceive things if it has to be that way around?
Yeah, there's a lot of that. I get a lot of that, like the recognition identification step between perceiving and action is a very I get that in my sport. I work it all the time, baseball. In order to hit a baseball, you have to recognize pitch is a fastball. No, you don't. No, you just need to know where it is and when it is, right? Maybe you do that. Maybe it could help you, but it's not necessary.
Yeah.
It's kind of a,
Would that be then where direct perception goes, that it's trying to flip that and saying that, we perceive things that are meaningful to us, and things that are meaningful we can then add a name to, rather than we can't perceive it, we can name it.
Yeah.
So Ed Baggs and Vicente Raja have a paper under review at the moment about a sidebar in Gibson 79, and the sidebar begins with the sentence, "To perceive an object is not to classify it," I think is the phrase.
Yes.
And it's basically Gibson sort of, he's writing a chapter and going, oh, actually, I just have to deal with this thing that they can't. And he whacks it in the box.
Yeah, that sounds like
Ed and Vicente have basically gone, that's quite important. We should probably remember this. And anyway, they're just trying to bring it out into the open, and it's exactly that, right? It's Gibson saying, you're not classifying an object by perceiving it. You're coupling to it. You're detecting it. You are perceiving it. But then classification is another thing.
Yeah.
And you don't necessarily need to do it. It's almost, I always think about, birds. We get giant magpies and crows around here, and they're out on the street, and they get out of the way of my car, not because they know it's a car, but because they can perceive that it's an approaching object that's intercepted, right? And that's actually, and so you get out of the way of those things, right? You don't need to know it's a car.
Like the seedling doesn't need to know whether something's a tree or not.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, it can't. That's actually one of the things lurking in the ecological understanding of perception, is that the vine has no way to know what a tree is. Luckily, it doesn't have to know what a tree is.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that actually it can't get to what a tree is, because it's got no access to anything that tells it that thing is a tree, right? It's got nothing from which to borrow that intelligence.
Yeah.
It turns out that that's okay because of how perception can actually work when there are laws within local niches and things like that. And that's lucky, because otherwise we'd be dead, right? Yeah.
I think that's really, like, for me, that was a really critical hurdle. The critical perception is not for knowing, for acting. Right? You don't need to know about things to act. I don't need to know where that fly ball is relative to me, or where it's going to land and when. I don't need to know any of that. I just need to couple actions to information that is related to that. Those and to specifies those properties. Those are very different things. I think that's a really important point.
Andrew, I think it's really interesting you talking about the fact that there's almost like been cognitive psychology. They've sort of dropped the consideration or owning up to that, learn on intelligence. Because I remember that was a big thing, and maybe just because of the people who I was with in my undergrad, it was kind of such a key thing that in information processing, you had this, like homunculus, infinite regress, whatever it was. You had this learn on intelligence that couldn't be applied, and that was the whole point of the work that Kelsall and Turvey, Kulger, Bunce, they were all doing was saying, okay, well then let's open this up and see if we can actually solve this.
But then other cognitive psychologists were also really still struggling with it. So people in the information processing kind of camp, philosophers like Hoagland and who else was it, like Churchland and all those people and Polishin and, everybody there were still serious people engaged with they were aware that this grounding problem existed and that they owed a solution. And it got talked about.
It got talked about.
All the way through the 90s. It showed up in my undergraduate education briefly in undergrad lectures, right? People would talk about these things. But then it just kind of vanished and people stopped talking about it as if it had been solved. Right?
I feel that fascinating, especially Rob, like when you say, I don't, coaches say, I don't have a theory, but they they do, they're just not acknowledging it.
I always wondered if it was just a generational thing. I wondered if the people who were around at the beginning trying to develop the cognitive approach, when they were still kind of fronting up to all the problems, Newell and all the original sort of cognitive people, they knew what they were up against. And the reason why they were excited about computation was that they thought they had a symbol system that was up to the challenge. That was what was exciting about it. It was a really good faith, we really think this might be a solution to this old problem, right? And I always wondered if it was a generational thing where it just got to the point where those people retired or died and their students took over, and their students had been brought up in a context not of having to figure it out from first principles, but they were taking advantage of the fact that some of it had already been worked out. And they sort of forgot to bring all of it with them. And I always just kind of wondered if that was a thing that happened.
He talks about Descartes starting with almost trying to do a direct perception, doesn't he? And then get stuck. So he set off in that direction. And that's saying and then realized that he couldn't explain everything and inserted God. So
I've got a couple questions about interface theory, Andrew.
Sure. I was trying
I put a link in there, the psych sign, Hoffman psych sign.
Yeah. So
interface theory and things like active inference.
Right. So
that's what I thought I'd let you. You've thought about this way more than me.
Yeah. So I was trying to post a link to my paper, but for some reason the comment I don't know why, but if you can track that down, Rob, for some reason I can't post it. It won't let me do it. Right. So interface theory is it's quite a good effort, really. It's an attempt to be really formal about all the implications of taking a representational approach to. If you begin with this Cartesian program, Hoffman's really actually doing the work of going back to the basics and working through the implications. But what was really funny to me was that he ends up in this really weird place and then just embraces it, right? And so he gets to this point where, okay, perception, because of the things it has to work with, it makes a bit of a mess. And so you end up having to invent your own kind of take on reality. And that's an interface in the same way that your Windows is an interface on the inner workings of a computer chip, right? It's like Windows, you know, when you double click on something, you don't literally double click on the actual chip, but by double clicking, the nature of the interface makes it so that double clicking actually acts on the actual chip, right? And so that's the analogy there. And then Hoffman talks about the grounding problem of how do you ground this to actual experience. And it's funny, he kind of embraces the solipsism and says, actually, you know, perception really is just completely divorced from reality. And he just thinks that's quite interesting. And that's kind of why the paper was made such a big splash. But he also does try to ground the whole process in action, because he does realize he owes the universe a grounding account of something, of some kind. And he tries to ground it effectively in a perception action loop, but it's the same problem. It's just a homunculus. It's a little loan of intelligence machine, basically, that doesn't actually pay anything off. But at least he's trying.
Yeah. I thought.
So that's and then so then in the paper that I wrote, basically in his main paper, he takes a swing at Gibson, and so I wrote a paper swinging back. And basically, I used a lot of Turvey's 1981 stuff to push back. So all the stuff that we're talking about, I kind of used it to push back on interface theory. So that was that. So it's kind of one of the interesting things about interface theory is that it's a really clear formalization of all the Cartesian implications that we're talking about. It's one of the reasons why I think actually everyone has to suck up the fact that Turvey is right, that it's all sitting on top of Descartes, is because when Hoffman really cranked through this, he basically landed on all of these things. He just didn't think it was a problem, right?
Yeah.
So that's one thing. Active inference is part of it's part of the free energy principle kind of approach.
Yeah.
An active inference. So the idea there is that you still need some sort of inferential process, but it doesn't have to be in the head, and it doesn't all have to be neural or computational. You can do inference with action. So some of that knowledge, some of that intelligence that you have to borrow, again, you're trying to ground it in action. And again, like that seems like quite an ecological move in some ways. But actually, it's not action that's going to be the place to ground stuff, because you still have to perceive actions. It's actually going to be the nature of information, I think, that's going to solve the grounding problem for ecological psychology, the lawful nature of information.
Yeah.
And how that works. That's providing it. It's the laws of physics are solving the grounding problem.
That's what Turvey's.
Yeah. But I've been thinking on and off about this. Since I wrote the interface theory paper, I really had to engage with a lot of Turvey stuff. And so I've had all these things on my mind, and people get very excited about Bayesian theory of this and active inference this and free energy principle of this and interface theory that. And I think, and obviously I'm a bit biased here, but I'm trying to be in good faith here. I think that Turvey's right, that all of those are just different flavors of implementing the Cartesian program. They're just using different words. But fundamentally, I think they're all implementing this Cartesian program, because they're all buying into the mechanistic hypothesis of what you're allowed to build your theory out of. I really do think that Turvey's right, and that he's really identified the core of what's going on here. And then in the next few chapters, what we're going to see, of course, is that if this is your program, then you're doomed.
Yeah.
Right. But that's for later.
That's coming. Yeah. No, thanks for it. Yeah, I agree, Andrew. I think, I don't know, active inference seems, well, obviously it's taking the problem of predicting something in the outside world and dodging around that by saying, let's predict the feedback we're going to receive about the action on the outside world. So I think that's definitely, but yeah, it still has some of the same issues.
Yes. I think I actually think it's just the same program dressed up in different clothes.
Yes.
They're all good faith attempts to solve the problem using those tools.
Yes.
I think. I don't think anyone's being a jerk about this. I think they really are trying to find ways within the bounds that they've allowed themselves to have imposed on them. They're trying to maneuver within those boundaries to find a solution, and they're trying to use the whole space. But I think what they keep coming up with is effectively the same basic program. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's true. Yeah, that's a good way.
Am I going to throw a real spanner in the works if I bring up Markov blankets and those kind of like Markov blankets?
Oh, right.
And yeah, because I've been trying to get my head around this a bit more, obviously, and understand active inference and predictive processing. And I think, from my understanding of Markov blankets, almost like this is, it's almost like a way of having a boundary on what you're including.
Mm-hmm.
And the degrees of freedom of connection between those things. So
yes,
if I would take a horse rider system, it would be the horse and the rider, and it's the connection between those, but it's the state of them, and almost using, like I say, this predicting from those states in that moment in time. So it's not as wide as an ecological perspective. It's not looking in the past, and it's not maybe looking at connecting. It's reducing the different systems that you're thinking about. You bound those systems and say, based on the current state of these systems, this is the most likely thing to happen next.
Yes. Yeah, I don't quite know enough of the really nitty gritty here. So the notion of basically
it's the edge of the system. Yeah. It's the boundary of the system. So you can make it bigger or smaller, but it's still then looking at the current state of those connected systems and what is likely to be, in the way Google, would predict the next word that's likely to come.
Right. And also, so the notion of a Markov boundary blanket is really just a way of formalizing the boundary between parts of systems. But one thing that's always confused me, and I've never been entirely sure, is there seem to be some odd rules about how things communicate across those boundaries that I can never quite tell if it's cheating or not. Everybody doing FEP seems to, talk about how you have, things going on inside the blanket and things going on outside the blanket, and those things can be arranged such that it looks like one is predicting the other, for example. But I've never quite. It's always, and right, this is partly because I don't fully understand all of the modern details of this, but it's always smelled a little magical to me.
Yeah. And to me, it feels like it misses the complex adaptability of those connected systems, and how, again, we go back into that loopy circular thing that then gets missed out, and intentionality. Maybe the aboutness bit is missing.
Yeah. I mean, I as I understand it, having chatted to people like Maxwell Ramstead who really do understand the maths, I do think modern formulations of all of this have really tried to engage with the complexity of all of these things. And it does at least seem plausible that it's quite a good. So we're all broadly on board with the idea that we need organism environment systems as a unit of analysis, and that we need dynamical systems as the language we're expressing a lot of these things in. I think that the modern flavors of the free energy principle, etc., are just exactly that. I think. And there's certainly ecological psychologists who have tried to connect ecological psychology up with the free energy principle.
Self-organization principle.
Yeah, because they see, Jelle Brunenberg's got a paper around this where he's just talking about they were really trying to connect those two things up because they saw some deep and non-trivial kind of connections there. So it's possible that the free energy principle might just be a really good mathematical framework for really modeling in detail the dynamics that you are talking about. Maybe. I don't know. But I think that might be the pitch. Yeah.
It's interesting, though, isn't it? And it's...
Yes.
Going back to my point earlier, maybe it'll work, but do we need all that? Right?
Seems to make it a lot more confusing.
Which I want to ask, what's the appeal of the Cartesian approach? What draws people to? Is it trying to? We've done all these brain experiments, recording when the brain's doing all these complicated things. You got to try to map it onto a cognitive symbol manipulation approach.
I think it's a little deeper than that. So I think that the reason why we have traditionally found all these brain imaging studies compelling is that they are the kind of evidence that people who grew up in a Cartesian world, or learning to think about the world in a Cartesian way, I think it's the kind of thing we find compelling. And so I think there's a suggestion that it's not just that this Cartesian model underpins just the scientific enterprise of psychology, but that it's actually really baked into the way people in the West have been talking about the mind and behavior for hundreds of years.
Yes.
And so a lot of our intuitions are that there is a body and that there is a mind and that those things feel different. And so I think that the reason why we find it appealing is that it matches the way how we learned how to talk about all of these things.
Yes.
And so there's studies looking at how other cultures do other things. There's a book, I can't remember the name of the book, but there was a book that kind of tracked the emergence of a whole bunch of kinds of mental illnesses in Eastern countries, and they arose as the East and the West came into contact and started talking to one another. And it sort of hadn't occurred to a lot of these countries to have these kinds of mental illnesses, that this book argues, because they didn't grow up with a Cartesian kind of framework. They had a Confucian kind of framework, or different kinds of understandings of the relationship of mind and body and all these kinds of things. And so that's another idea. That's another kind of piece to point to, is that none of this is compulsory, right? This is just an intellectual framework that was developed several hundred years ago based on what they knew and based on the tools that they had available to them as a really good faith effort to put things. And Descartes just did it in such a comprehensive way that it got into everything, but not everything everywhere, because not everybody read Descartes.
Yeah.
But we live in a pretty Cartesian educated world, is the idea there.
For sure.
And that's why it's appealing. It's not appealing because it's tapping some instinctive human understanding of how things go. It's appealing because this is how we grew up.
I think the opposite actually is true. When we kid, the way children perceive things, and if you start, in the research I've done with asking questions about their relationship with horses and what they think about, if I ask them about their experiences as a child, then we do something far more ecological. And it's when they then start thinking about what they've been told that you end up with a disconnect. And so, I mean, I remember writing some early papers, for coaches, and using, things like paddling and rivers and how they behave and weather, and thinking, I know if I connect to something they intuitively understand, hopefully it will work. Because I think when people do make that switch, I think the thing that's really important is initially when people start exploring this, they think they're adding knowledge as in an amount rather than in a sameness, and actually what it requires is them to think differently, not think more the way they already do. And I think that's the hard bit.
Yeah, I think there's always that resistance to that there's one, I don't know if science is the right word, that can explain it all, that can explain animals, rocks, people, right? Obviously religion, there's so bunch of things that throw a wrench in that, but I think there's also a real kind of urge to hold on to that separation of human beings are special. I think this really gets into some big things I think of sticking points. Yeah, I think you're both right. Like, part of what's going on here is Turvey's like changing the way we look at our grounding for how we understand the world: time, space, causality. Boom. Like, which is that's why I say, when you ecological psychology, if you really keep going into it, you eventually fall off a cliff, and in a good way, right? It really changes that. You can't unsee it once you see it. I think this chapter brings that up.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be important just to remember that the degree to which Gibson's theory is a radical one, we shouldn't forget. He's not just doing business as usual.
No.
He's doing something utterly different.
Yes.
And that's quite important to remember, I think. Alan Costel has a great paper about the textbook Gibson, about the assimilation of dissidents, right? And the idea is that cognitive psychology textbooks bring Gibson's ideas in, but they try and assimilate them.
Yeah.
So that affordances become mental things, or they try and fold it into existing theories. And so he has this whole paper just kind of pointing out that to do that modern psychology textbooks do this, and that it's a fundamental misreading of Gibson to do so.
Yes.
And what that is that's the empire striking back, right? That's the existing paradigm trying to assimilate Gibson before Gibson rips them apart, right? And so but that's it, like, and then it gets really complicated to explain to people that, because you do have to get people to think quite differently.
Yes.
In order for these things to make any sense. I think you're right, Marianne. It's certainly one of the things I hear about you guys interacting with coaches on a regular basis. It's one of the big arguments, right? Is this issue of vocabulary and the things you have to learn how to say and the ways you have to learn how to talk and think are so different that it's, then you get into all the arguments. Well, it's a lot of work, or it's very difficult, or, what if it's wrong, and can't we pick and choose? And, because
people who will quite happily learn, I don't know, the Latin names of every muscle and
yeah, I know that frustrates me too. Affordance is difficult, but you know what an anterior cruciate ligament means, right?
That's just all part of the Descartes' first sense of knowing, or first grade of sensing, or whatever it is. It's fine. How hard can that be, right?
I've noticed we've got some comments. Actually, I've just found the comments.
You see anything? Yeah, sorry.
People who, I'm wondering whether
anything out you see, Marianne.
Respond to some of the things that people are adding.
Yeah.
I see one of them there around entropy, which is interesting.
Yeah, I think there's definitely active inference. I think their point is they use a lot of the same concepts as ecological psychology, self-organization, complex system. So I think they're getting rid of a lot of the main problems that Turvey's gonna, in future chapters, is gonna really hammer in that this creates. And I know, I don't remember them being such a bad read. I haven't read them recently. The cognitive, is it cognitive structures series? There's 3, aren't there? Cognitive structures.
Yeah, sure.
And they talk about autopoietic systems, entropies. It's all in there in these. It's not something that's been completely forgotten or not, or not picked up until.
Well, Kugler in particular, we're working with Turvey.
Yeah.
Really, they've got many papers where they're really grinding through some of the physics on this.
Yeah.
And really, it's been a long time since I've interacted with that stuff as well, but. And
Kelsol's stuff around what do you call energetic constraints? So again, looking at so there's some great stuff to read in the background of this. That really, really helps. I always think of things like play as being one of the things that anti-entropy. Like, why making us motivated to do something rather than sit in the dark room kind of thing. Like, how as a species, we're not stable behaviorally or physically, which is really important.
Yeah, but that's the difficult thing about us that we're trying to explain, the fact that we aren't just pushed around passively by the world. We do, right? And that turns out to be the really difficult thing to try and explain. That's the thing that's the intention.
That's what we're trying to explain. The intentionality. That intentionality is shared by many of the non-human animals.
Yes.
You know, and as we've, again, I think it's the other thing that's really interesting from all of this is the science, like you said, mathematics has just been invented. It's still people are still very religious. So you've got the sort of the socio-cultural environment in which these people were exploring have shaped very much the way in which they think. And now, you know, like the way in which we understand our world now is based on the advancements that we have in technology and the way that we understand and connect to our world, which is phenomenal, and perceive things that we as humans would not be able to perceive without that technology.
I mean, that's really going to be one of Turvey's points, is that all of this stuff is based on 17th century physics. But you know what? There's quite a lot has happened in the last.
We've moved on. Yeah.
And so maybe psychology should too, right?
Update ourselves.
Yeah. And that's what all the coordinative dynamics and all that energetic stuff, all those things is just, we have a more interesting toolkit than we've been giving ourselves credit for.
And it's worth the effort.
And it's worth the effort because it gets you out of a bunch of holes potentially, or at least it's not just new ways of going at the problem in the same way. It's a fundamentally different way of going about trying to solve the problem. That at least in principle doesn't end round around. It avoids all of those problems. We're probably going to run into a lot of our own problems.
But
it at least avoids all the ones we've had several hundred years banging our head against unsuccessfully, right? So,
I think Turvey's really trying to set us up to ask the right questions. Do ecological psychology. That's really what he's trying to lay out.
What are we perceiving?
What does it mean to be direct? Yeah, for sure. Any last take home from all of this? I don't know. Like I said, it's just it does fit, like we said at the start, this is not a chapter traditional for book. This was a lecture. So these two kind of really read like that to me. I think I would have hearing them would have been more, because it's kind of, I have a hard time parsing it a little bit. There's a lot of useful stuff in there. But
I really do find these quite difficult to read. I do find that it can be very hard to see why Turvey is talking about this thing followed by this thing.
Exactly.
Why did you go there? And sometimes it remains unclear. Sometimes it's like, oh, he just wanted to tell you about that, I think.
That's what I mean. It sounds like almost an aside in a lecture. I just thought of this. That's what I do all the time. It came across a little bit like that. So,
but we are going to see some of the upcoming chapters. We've got a bunch of lectures there's a whole bunch about space perception, and it's all about, let's take these theories, these particular ways of going about solving the problem, and throw them at one of the big problems in perception. How do we have an experience of three-dimensional space? Right. And what we're going to do is we're just going to take multiple runs at that problem, and we're going to run face first into a couple of walls every single time. And it's going to be like taking all of this stuff for a ride to see how far you can push it, right? To try and that'll reveal how and why some of this stuff breaks.
I think this book is also a little meta in the sense with that last time we were talking about things that are defined by the system they're in. I think once you get the whole thing together, it'll start to hang together a bit more.
Impredicativity all the way around.
That was what I was trying to think of. It's definitely
We talked a little bit just before we went live as well, and this idea that to me, it feels like Turvey is going, like, you need to put the effort into learning this, and not doing it for you, and that always makes me smile. When we think about coaching, it's like, who's doing the thinking, who's doing the problem solving? If it's the coach,
Right.
then the athlete's not learning. And I always feel like Turvey's got it. He's like, you need to learn this.
Don't give him the answers.
So
just
that
give
you
him the test.
have to put the effort into it.
Yeah.
Sure. But yeah, like we said, but it's worth it. And I mean, those, like I say, those 2 chapters do feel like they're almost like a single one, aren't they? He's just setting up, like, this is the kind of like ontological foundations on which everything that's become so imbued within our language and our education systems and everything else. And yeah, there's some amazing stuff that's come from that in science and technology and what we've developed. But actually, maybe an update is due.
Yeah,
or at least an acknowledgement of that, to think about where we go forward in this.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, maybe we'll wrap it up there, guys. I hope we gave you another example through our own struggles. Made you feel better. I'm sure it did. We'll keep cracking ahead. Like I said, I think you'll see this pay off. I've already feel the first couple of chapters have paid off in this one. But I think you'll see a payoff later on, the ones we read. So we'll do the next couple next time. So thanks everyone for joining us, the comments and everything. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining.
Bye.
Okay, guys.